In today's video, we explore the horrifying last moments of circus animal trainers. From the lightning-fast strikes of several cats in captivity, to the pummels of primates in distress against humans. But first, we begin in Brazil, where a trainer meets a grim end at the mercy of a lion. It was September 18, 2014, the Brazilian sun beating down mercilessly on the dusty lot outside João Pessoa, where Circo Novo Horizonte had pitched its weathered tents. Behind a rusted shipping container, a makeshift training ring sat under sagging tarps, their edges lifting in the dry breeze. Inside, a predator paced in the shade, silent, watching, waiting. Katrina Esteves had circus sawdust in her blood. At 31, she represented the third generation of her family to work with big cats, having inherited both the passion and the peril from her father, who had trained lions for decades before her. She specialized in lions, Africa's most iconic predator and a staple of traditional circus acts. Her current charge was Nero, a 420-pound male with golden fur and a thick, growing mane. Lions may not have the jaguar's crushing bite, but their killing method is no less brutal. Their jaws can exert up to 650 psi, and their 3-inch canines are designed to crush windpipes and sever spinal cords. Unlike solitary cats, lions are ambush predators that rely on explosive speed, overwhelming force, and lethal precision to bring down prey much larger than themselves, even in captivity. Nero had been confiscated as a cub from wildlife traffickers and raised in captivity, never knowing the open savannas where his ancestors once hunted. While early human contact had made him somewhat manageable, it had not erased his instincts. 6 months earlier, Nero had lunged at another handler during feeding time, leaving deep gashes on his thigh that required over a dozen stitches. The incident had been quietly covered up, with no official report filed to Brazilian wildlife authorities. That afternoon, the midday show had concluded an hour earlier, and the sparse crowd had dispersed into the heat. Katrina returned to the training ring to repair a wooden perch that had been wobbling during Nero's performance. The lion lay stretched in the far corner of his enclosure, seeking relief from the oppressive heat in a narrow strip of shade. Paulo Mendes, a teenage assistant who had been working at the circus for only 3 months, stood outside the enclosure's main gate. He held a set of keys and a spray bottle filled with water, waiting for Katrina's signal to assist with the repairs. The circus operated without formal safety protocols, and no tranquilizer equipment was readily available, a dangerous oversight when working with apex predators. Katrina entered the enclosure and knelt beside the damaged perch, her back partially turned to Nero as she hammered a metal bracket into place. The lion remained motionless, watching with the patient focus of a born hunter. Then, without warning, Nero covered the distance between himself and Katrina in less than 2 seconds. Paulo later described the attack as eerily silent. Just the soft thump of massive paws hitting sawdust and Katrina's sharp intake of breath as she realized her mistake. The lion's 420-pound frame slammed into her with devastating force, powerful jaws clamping down on her right shoulder with bone-crushing pressure. The impact sent Katrina sprawling sideways, her hammer flying across the enclosure as she crashed to the ground. Lions kill by suffocation or spinal trauma. Nero's jaws, designed for crushing tracheas and vertebrae, tore through muscle and sinew as he adjusted his grip, seeking Katrina's neck. Paulo screamed and fumbled desperately with the enclosure door, but the warped metal latch jammed halfway open. Inside the ring, Katrina fought frantically to push the lion away, but Nero's massive body pinned her to the sawdust-covered ground. The cat's jaws found their target, clamping down on Katrina's neck. For nearly 40 seconds that felt like an eternity, Paulo could only watch in horror as his colleague's life ebbed away. Blood pooled rapidly beneath Katrina's body as her struggles grew weaker. Nero remained crouched over his victim, growling intermittently as his predatory instincts took complete control. The lion's powerful jaws worked methodically, tearing at muscle and tissue along Katrina's spine and shoulders. By the time two senior handlers arrived with metal poles and a pry bar, Katrina had stopped moving entirely. The men forced open the jammed door and jabbed at Nero with their poles until he finally retreated to the far corner. Katrina's body was rushed by truck to a nearby clinic, but paramedics could only confirm what everyone already knew. She had died from massive blood loss, spinal trauma, and a severed carotid artery. Brazilian environmental authorities quietly removed Nero under sedation and transferred him to a wildlife rehabilitation center. No charges were filed against the circus, though investigators noted the complete absence of safety protocols and the history of previous attacks. Circo Novo Horizonte retired its big cat acts permanently, and Katrina Esteves was buried in a small ceremony attended only by family and fellow circus workers. As the sawdust settled around Katrina's broken body, thousands of miles away in a Hungarian barn, a primate specialist was about to learn that 20 years of experience meant nothing to a 380-pound silverback gorilla whose patience had finally reached its breaking point. It was June 7, 2015, and the last rays of Hungarian sunlight slipped through the warped slats of a decaying livestock barn outside Budapest. Beneath the faded circus banners and aging timber, something massive stirred. Edith Varga moved quietly through the barn toward the reinforced enclosure that housed her most dangerous charge. At 44, she had dedicated over 2 decades of her life to working with exotic animals in Hungary's struggling circus industry. Her specialty was primates, and she had earned a reputation for her patient, methodical approach to training even the most difficult animals. For the past 8 years, Edith's primary focus had been Kato, a western lowland gorilla acquired through questionable channels along the Romanian border. The massive silverback had never performed publicly, serving instead as a training project and a private attraction for the small circus. At 380 pounds, Kato embodied raw power. Silverback gorillas are among the most powerful creatures on Earth, with adult males possessing the strength of 10 men. Their massive arms evolved for swinging through forest canopies and knuckle-walking across the ground can exert forces exceeding 1,800 psi. Though typically calm, they can become violently aggressive under stress, delivering blows strong enough to shatter a human skull. Kato had been raised in captivity since infancy, never knowing the dense forest of Central Africa where his species had evolved over millions of years. While this early human contact had made him somewhat manageable, it had also created behavioral abnormalities common in captive primates. He showed particular sensitivity to loud male voices and sudden environmental changes, triggers that Edith tried to manage through careful routine and controlled exposure. That evening's session was intended to be routine, feeding time followed by basic cue training using hand signals and vocal commands. Edith had already secured the barn's outer door and entered Kato's reinforced enclosure area. Her longtime partner, Janos, was working on a ladder in the far corner of the barn, repairing overhead lighting that had been malfunctioning for weeks. Janos later recalled hearing Edith's gentle voice as she greeted Kato, coaxing him forward with half of a ripe melon, one of the gorilla's favorite treats. The interaction seemed normal, even pleasant, with no signs of agitation from either human or animal. The barn was quiet except for the soft sounds of Edith's voice and the occasional grunt of acknowledgement from Kato. Then, without warning, the peaceful atmosphere shattered. A sharp, piercing scream echoed through the barn, followed immediately by the sickening sound of a heavy body striking wood. Janos spun around on his ladder to see Kato hurling Edith against the far wall of the enclosure with devastating force. Edith crumpled to the hay-covered floor but somehow managed to move, crawling desperately toward the enclosure door on her hands and knees. Blood streamed from her head where it had struck the wooden barrier, and her movements were unsteady and disoriented. But Kato was far from finished with his attack. The massive silverback reached Edith before she could cover even half the distance to safety. His powerful hand seized her leg, and he dragged her back toward the center of the enclosure. Kato stood over his victim, swaying slightly in the characteristic manner of agitated gorillas, then began beating his chest, a display behavior that in the wild serves as both intimidation and preparation for violence. Kato struck Edith's torso repeatedly with both massive fists, each blow delivered with enough force to crush ribs and rupture internal organs. Low, guttural sounds rose from his throat as he continued the assault, vocalizations that animal behaviorists recognize as expressions of extreme stress and aggression in captive gorillas. Hanos watched in horror from his perch on the ladder, knowing that any attempt to intervene would likely result in his own death. The enclosure had no emergency barriers or safety protocols, leaving him helpless to assist his partner. In desperation, he climbed down and ran through the barnyard, shouting for help from other circus workers. When Hanos returned with 2 men, neither trained in animal handling, they found Edith lying motionless in a spreading pool of blood. Her face was grotesquely swollen, and the left side of her skull showed clear signs of massive blunt force trauma. Kato stood several feet away, emitting soft, distressed grunts. The violent rage had passed, replaced by what appeared to be confusion and anxiety. However, he remained protective of the enclosure space, preventing anyone from approaching Edith's body. It took over 2 hours for authorities and vets to arrive with sedation gear. Only after Kato was tranquilized could responders retrieve Edith's body. Paramedics confirmed she had died within minutes. Hungarian animal welfare officials immediately confiscated Kato and transported him to a primate sanctuary outside Szeged, where he was placed in quarantine for behavioral evaluation. The small circus ceased operations within a month, unable to continue after losing both its primary trainer and its most valuable animal. Edith Varga was buried in a quiet ceremony attended by fewer than 20 people, her death serving as another tragic reminder of the unpredictable dangers inherent in working with powerful wild animals. In Hungary, it took just seconds for trust to shatter under the weight of a silverback's fury. Half a world away in South Africa, another expert would make the same fatal mistake, but this time with an elephant. It was April 26, 2013, the Italian sun casting long shadows across the dusty lot where Circo Medrano had pitched its tents on the outskirts of Naples. The circus had been performing for a week, drawing modest crowds to its faded big top beside an abandoned supermarket. Behind the main ring, in a cramped enclosure barely large enough for her massive frame, an elephant shifted restlessly. Luca Ferri had dedicated 37 years of his life to working with elephants. At 58, the weathered trainer from Benevento had earned respect throughout Italy's circus community for his methodical approach and deep understanding of these magnificent creatures. His relationship with Mara, a 6-ton Asian elephant, spanned nearly 2 decades. She had been confiscated as a calf from illegal traders and raised entirely in captivity, knowing nothing of the wild forest where her species had roamed for millennia. What Luca may not have fully grasped was the immense power contained within the animal he worked with daily. Asian elephants weigh up to 11,000 pounds and can charge at 25 miles per hour. Their trunks have over 40,000 muscles and can lift up to 770 pounds, while their feet exert 75 psi, easily enough to crush bone. Most critically, elephants have complex emotional lives and can experience frustration, depression, and rage, particularly when confined in inadequate spaces for extended periods. That morning, Mara had refused her breakfast and displayed signs of distress that should have served as clear warnings. She had trumpeted repeatedly during the night, a vocalization that experienced handlers recognized as a sign of agitation. Her ears flapped constantly, and she swayed from side to side, stereotypical behaviors exhibited by captive elephants under psychological stress. The previous evening's performance had gone poorly, with Mara refusing to complete several routine tricks and becoming increasingly unresponsive to Luca's commands. Despite these warning signs, Luca entered the enclosure alone against established safety protocols that required at least 2 handlers to be present during any direct contact with the elephants. His intention was to calm her through familiar interaction and re-establish the trust that seemed to be eroding between them. The other circus workers were busy preparing equipment for the weekend shows, unaware that their colleague was about to make his final mistake. David Romani, a younger handler who had worked under Luca's guidance for 3 years, was adjusting loading ramps near the animal trailers when he heard the commotion begin. Inside the enclosure, Luca approached Mara with the confidence born of decades of experience. He spoke to her in soothing Italian, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had served him well throughout his career. For a moment, the massive elephant seemed calm, her intelligent eyes watching his every movement. Then, Mara's ears suddenly flared wide, a clear sign of agitation that Luca should have recognized immediately. Her trunk rose, testing the air, and she let out a sharp, piercing trumpet that echoed across the circus grounds. In that instant, years of suppressed frustration and psychological stress erupted into deadly violence. Mara charged with the explosive power that had made her ancestors the most feared animals in ancient warfare. Her massive forehead struck Luca's chest with the force of a battering ram, launching him backward into the steel bars of the enclosure. The impact drove the air from his lungs and sent him crashing to the concrete floor. Before Luca could recover, Mara was upon him. Her trunk, capable of delicate manipulation or crushing force, wrapped around his torso and lifted him effortlessly into the air. With a violent shake of her massive head, she hurled him against the enclosure wall like a rag doll. The sickening crack of breaking bones echoed through the morning air. David heard the commotion and rushed toward the elephant enclosure, grabbing a metal pipe along the way. He banged frantically against the bar, shouting at the top of his lungs in a desperate attempt to distract Mara from her victim. But the elephant was beyond reason, driven by instincts that no amount of training could suppress. Mara positioned herself over Luca's broken body and brought her full weight down upon him. Her massive foot, designed to support tons of body weight across soft jungle terrain, crushed his ribcage. By the time additional circus personnel arrived, Luca Ferry was beyond help. His body lay motionless beneath the elephant's feet, blood pooling around his head where it had struck the concrete. Called by the personnel, the paramedics arrived within minutes but could only confirm what everyone already knew. Luca had died from multiple traumatic injuries, his body no match for the raw power of an agitated elephant. Luca's funeral was held 3 days later in Benevento, attended by family, former circus colleagues, and animal rights observers who maintained a respectful silence. His casket was adorned with a single carved elephant figurine. Mara was immediately sedated and removed from the circus. Unlike many similar incidents, there were no calls for her destruction. Animal behaviorists who examined the case noted that her actions, while tragic, were entirely predictable given the stress of captivity and inadequate living conditions. She was transferred to a zoological facility where she could receive proper care. Circo Madrano quietly resumed performances the following week, but their elephant acts were permanently retired. As the dust settled over an elephant's final, furious stand in a Neapolitan lot, thousands of miles away, a lion waited in silence for a man who trusted tranquilizers more than instinct. It was November 23, 2016, the South African sun hanging low over the Dryveld near Rustenburg. In its dusty ground, the small touring circus had established its temporary camp. The staging area consisted of little more than a clearing lined with weathered trailers, makeshift wire enclosures, and battered equipment that had seen better decades. Simon Du Plessis represented a rare breed in South Africa's entertainment industry, a licensed veterinarian who specialized in big cat behavior and physiology. At 38, he had built a reputation for his calm professionalism and deep understanding of the complex psychological needs of captive predators. Regional circuses frequently consulted him on sedation protocols, dietary requirements, and the subtle behavioral signals that could indicate dangerous stress levels in their animals. His current assignment involved Bantu, a 7-year-old male lion with a documented history of unpredictable aggression. The 420-pound predator had been acquired as a cub and raised entirely in captivity. Bantu's behavioral issues were well documented. He had once destroyed a steel water bowl during a fit of rage, bending the heavy metal with his bare claws and teeth. African lions are among nature's most efficient killers, with males weighing up to 550 pounds and possessing the strength of 10 men. Their massive jaws can exert bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch, while their razor-sharp claws can grow up to 3 inches long. Most notably, lions are ambush predators evolved to kill prey much larger than themselves through precise attacks targeting the throat and spine, techniques that remain lethally effective even in captive-born animals. That morning, Bantu had been lightly sedated in preparation for a relocation to another town where the circus would perform for a week. The standard protocol involved administering enough tranquilizer to keep the lion calm during transport while avoiding the respiratory depression that could prove fatal in the confined space of a travel trailer. Simon had personally overseen the sedation, calculating the dosage based on Bantu's weight and stress levels. By late afternoon, Simon returned to clean and refill the trowel, assuming the sedative was still effective. However, individual animals metabolize drugs at different rates, and factors such as stress, temperature, and recent feeding can accelerate the process. Believing Bantu was still subdued, Simon fatally entered the enclosure without backup or a second handler. Themba Mokoena, the circus groundskeeper, saw Simon approach the lion's enclosure with a bucket and hose, calmly saying he'd just need 2 minutes to finish up. Bantu lay in the shadowed corner of his pen, eyes half closed in what appeared to be a drug-induced lethargy. The enclosure was a temporary chain-link structure with steel posts and razor wire, sufficient for containment but lacking emergency safeguards. Simon unlatched the gate and stepped confidently inside. For several seconds, nothing happened. The only sounds were the wind rustling through the dry grass and the distant hum of a malfunctioning electric fence. Then, without warning, a low growl rumbled from the shadowed corner where Bantu lay. The sound carried across the veld, causing Themba to look up from his work with sudden alarm. The attack unfolded with the explosive speed that had made lions the most feared predators in Africa. Bantu launched himself from his resting position, covering the 20-foot distance to Simon in less than 3 seconds. His massive frame struck the veterinarian squarely in the chest, sending both figures tumbling. Simon fought desperately for his life, trying to shield his face while kicking upward at the lion's muzzle. Bantu's jaws clamped down on Simon's upper arm with bone-crushing force, and the lion began the characteristic head-shaking motion that tears flesh from bone. Themba sprinted toward the supply shed, screaming for help while searching frantically for anything that might serve as a weapon. By the time Themba returned with a long wooden pole, the situation had deteriorated beyond hope. Bondu's massive jaws are now locked around the base of Simon's neck. With a violent shake of his powerful head, Bondu delivered the killing bite. The veterinarian's body went limp as his cervical spine was likely crushed. Bondu dragged his victim several feet across the dusty ground before crouching protectively beside the motionless form. Other circus workers eventually arrived with a tranquilizer rifle, but it took nearly 10 minutes to deliver a clean shot that would render the lion unconscious without risking further violence. They immediately dialed for help. Simon Duplessis was pronounced dead at the scene by paramedics who arrived too late to provide any meaningful assistance. The medical examiner's report cited cervical spine trauma, a crushed larynx, and asphyxiation as the primary causes of death. Evidence suggested that Simon had remained conscious through the initial moments of the attack, experiencing the full horror of his situation before succumbing to his injuries. Bondu was relocated to a wildlife rehabilitation center, though his ultimate fate remained undisclosed to the public. The small circus suspended operations indefinitely. Simon's funeral was held 3 days later in a quiet Johannesburg chapel, attended by family, fellow veterinarians, and several handlers who had worked alongside him. No media were allowed, and his ashes were later scattered in a private ceremony near Kruger National Park, where he had first studied lions as a university student. Just 16 months after Simon's miscalculation let a lion tear through steel fencing and bone, an alley behind a Malaysian mall became the scene of another breach, this time a chimpanzee. It was March 3rd, 2018, and Penang's tropical heat pressed down on the rusted rooftops behind Lotus Mall, where a circus pen baked unseen behind tarps and fencing. Just beyond the food court dumpsters, a young man was about to enter a cage with a deadly animal. Ong Lin had been working with the circus for only 5 months, a quiet 27-year-old from Impo who had stumbled into animal care through family connections rather than passion or expertise. His cousin worked part-time handling the circus's collection of colorful parrots, and when a position opened for an animal caretaker, Ong reluctantly accepted despite having no relevant experience. His tourism degree had failed to secure stable employment, leaving him with few alternatives in Malaysia's competitive job market. The circus had assigned Ong to care for 2 adolescent chimpanzees, recent acquisitions from an undisclosed supplier whose origin raised questions among the more experienced handlers. The younger of the 2 animals, a male named Bakar, had been displaying increasingly aggressive behavior since their last relocation. His symptoms included frequent screaming, violent resistance to handlers, and defensive lunges during feeding times. Inexperienced, Ong likely didn't understand the incredible strength and unpredictable nature of the animals under his care. Chimpanzees share over 98% of our DNA, but have strength far beyond human limits. Adults are 5 to 7 times stronger, with arms capable of over 1,300 pounds of force, crushing grips, and sharp canines. Their intelligence and emotional volatility make sudden deadly outbursts dangerously unpredictable. Senior trainers warned Ong never to enter the enclosure alone, especially during off hours. Chimpanzees were to be crated for cleaning, with 2 handlers present for aggressive ones. These protocols existed for good reason. Captive chimps have caused severe, sometimes fatal attacks worldwide. That afternoon, during the troop's scheduled break period, Ong returned to the chimpanzee pen to clean food bowls and tidy the enclosure floor, tasks that weren't part of his assigned routine for that day. He didn't request backup assistance, nor did he follow proper safety procedures. The chimpanzees had not been secured in their individual crates, and the chain-link gate to their enclosure remained partially open. The area behind the mall was relatively quiet, with only the distant hum of ventilation fans and the occasional clatter of cutlery from the food court dumpsters nearby. Soraya, a janitor taking her afternoon smoke break, observed Ong entering the enclosure with a red plastic tub to collect the scattered feeding bowls. Initially, the scene appeared routine. One chimpanzee sat quietly in the shade while Ong crouched near the far side of the pen, methodically gathering the metal containers. Bakar, however, paced restlessly along the fence, erratic, dominant behavior that signaled rising aggression. In a confined pen, it should have triggered immediate evacuation. Then, inevitably, Bakar erupted into violent action. The 130-pound primate rushed forward and struck Ong with devastating force, knocking him sideways onto the concrete floor of the enclosure. Ong fell hard, raising one hand instinctively to protect himself, but Bakar was already upon him. The chimpanzee's attack followed patterns observed in wild populations: rapid, overwhelming violence designed to incapacitate threats quickly and decisively. Bakar screamed repeatedly as he struck Ong's head with both powerful fists. Soraya later described the horrific sound of the blows as resembling wet cloth hitting pavement. She shouted and waved her arms frantically, hoping to distract the enraged animal, but Bakar's fury had only begun to manifest. By the time Soraya's screams brought help from nearby delivery workers, Ong lay motionless in an expanding pool of blood. The rescuers used a water hose to spray through the fence, finally driving Bakar back to the far corner of the enclosure where he continued pacing and shrieking in agitation. Ong remained conscious when circus staff arrived upon hearing the commotion, moaning softly and clutching his injured side. He was transported to Penang General Hospital in a tour van, but his injuries were too severe for medical intervention to be effective. Multiple head wounds, facial fractures, and severe damage to both hands told the story of a prolonged and brutal attack. He died 5 hours later from internal bleeding and blunt force trauma to the skull. Malaysian wildlife officials removed Bakar under heavy sedation that evening, transporting him to a primate holding facility in Borneo, where his ultimate fate remained undisclosed. Ong Lin was buried in a modest Buddhist ceremony in Ipoh, his death serving as another tragic reminder of the dangers inherent in working with powerful wild animals without proper training or safety protocols. Thanks for watching. If these deadly encounters caught your attention, the next video dives into even more ruthless predators. See you then.